This is what I'd been looking for all those years ago when I was 25 and in love with the idea of love. Not the fairy tale romance I'd imagined, but something better. A real partnership built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the radical idea that love should make you feel more like yourself, not less. I'd spent so many years believing that my mother was right about love hurting. But she was only half right. Love does hurt sometimes. When it ends, when it's tested, when it requires difficult choices. But it shouldn't hurt while it's happening. It shouldn't diminish you or demand that you disappear pieces of yourself to make room for someone else's comfort. The kind of love worth having feels like coming home to yourself, over and over again, in the presence of another person who's doing the same thing. That night, after the kids had gone to bed and Michael and I were cleaning up the kitchen together, a task that now felt like partnership rather than performance, I found myself thinking about all the women who might be reading this story, recognizing pieces of their own lives in mine. To those women, I want to say this: your intuition about what you deserve is probably right. The voice in your head that whispers, "This isn't how it's supposed to feel," is worth listening to. The dreams you've put aside, the interests you've abandoned, the parts of yourself you've learned to hide, they're still there, waiting for you to reclaim them. Leaving isn't easy. Building a new life from scratch requires courage and resources, and support that not everyone has access to. I was privileged in ways that made my escape possible. I had family who could help, education that allowed me to support myself, and ultimately access to legal representation and therapeutic support. But even if your circumstances are different, even if your path to freedom looks nothing like mine, the fundamental truth remains. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not who someone else needs you to become. You deserve partnership, not management. You deserve to feel like yourself in your own life. The story I've told you isn't just about leaving a bad marriage. It's about the longer, harder, more important work of coming home to yourself, of learning to trust your own judgment, to value your own opinions, to take up space in your own life. Some days that work is dramatic, packing bags in the middle of the night, standing up to bullies, making choices that change everything. But most days it's quieter, choosing what to make for dinner based on what you actually want to eat, wearing clothes that make you feel good, saying no to requests that don't serve you or your family. It's the accumulation of 1,000 small acts of self-respect that eventually add up to a life you recognize as your own. My story has a happy ending, but it's not the ending I expected when I was 25 and walking down the aisle in my grandmother's pearls. It's better than what I expected because it's real, messy and complicated and sometimes difficult, but built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect that can weather whatever storms come our way. Emma and Jake will grow up understanding that relationships require work, but also that the work should feel like collaboration rather than constant criticism. They'll know that love can be both safe and exciting, predictable and surprising, ordinary and extraordinary all at the same time. And maybe, when they're older and making their own choices about partners and marriage and what kind of life they want to build, they'll remember the lesson their mother learned the hard way, that you can't love someone else properly until you've learned to love and value yourself. That's the real plot twist. Not that I found the courage to leave a bad situation, but that I found the wisdom to recognize my own worth and the strength to insist that others recognize it too. The woman who walked down the aisle in her grandmother's pearls had to disappear so that the woman I was meant to become could finally breathe. And she's still becoming, still growing, still discovering new facets of herself in the safety of a love that celebrates rather than constrains her. That's the beautiful thing about getting free. You realize that the story isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. What struck me most about Michael was how he listened. Really listened, without waiting for his turn to speak or formulating judgments about what I was saying. When I mentioned my divorce, he didn't ask what had gone wrong or why I'd left. Instead, he asked how I was doing now, what I'd learned about myself, what I was looking forward to. We dated slowly, carefully. Both of us had children to consider, wounds that were still healing, hard-won independence we were reluctant to compromise. But gradually, we built something together that felt entirely different from what I'd experienced in my marriage. Michael never criticized my appearance, my housekeeping, or my parenting decisions. When he disagreed with something I said or did, he expressed his perspective respectfully and listened to mine in return. He had opinions and preferences, but he didn't expect me to automatically defer to them. More importantly, he seemed to genuinely like who I was, not some improved version he hoped I'd become, but the actual person sitting across from him. He laughed at my jokes, respected my intelligence, and valued my input on decisions that affected both of us. Emma and Jake were initially wary of any man who might become important to their mother. They'd learned to be protective of our small family unit, suspicious of changes that might disrupt the stability we'd built. But Michael won them over gradually, through patience and genuine interest in their lives, rather than any attempt to position himself as a replacement father. When we moved in together after a year of dating, it felt like a choice made from abundance rather than necessity. We weren't trying to complete each other or fill gaps in our respective lives. We were two whole people choosing to share a life because we enjoyed each other's company and wanted to build something together. The contrast with my first marriage couldn't have been more stark. Where David had sought to manage and control me, Michael sought to support and encourage me. Where I'd learned to anticipate criticism and disapproval, I now experienced acceptance and appreciation. It wasn't perfect. No relationship is. We had disagreements about money, about parenting styles, about how to balance our respective children's needs. But we approached these challenges as partners, working together to find solutions rather than engaging in power struggles about who was right. Emma and Jake thrived in our blended family. Michael's daughter, Sophie, became like an older sister to them, patient with their childish antics and protective when they faced challenges at school or with friends. Our house was louder and messier than the pristine home I'd tried to maintain during my marriage, but it was filled with laughter and genuine affection. One evening, about 6 months after we'd all moved in together, Emma came to find me in the kitchen while I was cleaning up after dinner. "Mom," she said, leaning against the counter while I loaded the dishwasher, "I like it better here than at Dad's house." "Oh?" I tried to keep my voice neutral. The kids' relationship with their father was complicated, and I'd learned to be careful about how I responded to their observations about the differences between our households. "Yeah," she continued. "It's more relaxed here. Like if I spill something or forget to put my dishes away, you just remind me to clean it up. You don't get mad or make it seem like I did something terrible." Her observation was both heartbreaking and validating. She was old enough now to recognize the difference between households where mistakes were treated as learning opportunities versus character flaws. "Everyone makes mistakes, sweetheart," I told her. "The important thing is that we try to do better next time." "I know," she said, then paused. "Mom, are you going to marry Michael?" The question caught me off guard, though I probably should have expected it. Kids are remarkably perceptive about adult relationships, often seeing things more clearly than the adults themselves. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "We haven't talked about that yet. How would you feel if we did?" She considered this seriously, the way she approached most decisions. "I think I'd be okay with it," she said finally. "He's nice to you, and to us, and he doesn't try to change things all the time." Out of the mouths of babes, again. Michael and I did get married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in Rebecca's backyard, with our combined families and closest friends in attendance. Emma and Jake served as ring bearers, while Sophie was my maid of honor. It was nothing like my first wedding, simpler, more intimate, focused on celebration rather than performance. David attended with his girlfriend, now wife, and while the situation was initially awkward, everyone behaved civilly for the children's sake. There's something to be said for the healing power of time and the perspective it provides. Standing in my sister's garden, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my happiness, making promises to a man who saw and valued the real me, I felt like I was finally living the life I was meant to have. Not perfect. Life never is. We still dealt with the complexities of co-parenting with David, the challenges of blending two families, the normal stresses of work and children and daily life. But we faced these challenges as partners, with respect and affection, and a shared commitment to building something healthy and sustainable. Emma is 16 now, a junior in high school with plans to study psychology in college. She's confident and articulate, comfortable expressing her opinions and standing up for herself, qualities I hope she learned from watching me rebuild my life after divorce. Jake is 13, all elbows and attitude and surprising moments of sweetness. He plays soccer and loves video games and is starting to notice girls, milestones that feel both monumental and perfectly ordinary. Sophie is in college, studying environmental science and calling home every Sunday to update us on her latest adventures. She still considers Emma and Jake her siblings, despite the fact that her parents' divorce preceded her father's relationship with me. And David, he seems content with his life, though our interactions remain cordial rather than warm. He's a decent father, even if he's not particularly flexible or emotionally available. He provides for the kids financially and shows up to their school events and athletic competitions. It's not the co-parenting relationship I might have hoped for, but it's workable. Sometimes I wonder what my life might have looked like if I'd never found the courage to leave my first marriage. Would I have eventually adapted completely to David's expectations, become the woman he wanted me to be? Would the kids have learned to accept that tension and criticism as normal parts of family life? I'm grateful I'll never have to find out. The most important lesson I've learned is that love shouldn't require you to become smaller, quieter, less yourself in order to earn it. Real love, the kind worth having, celebrates who you are while supporting who you're becoming. It doesn't seek to manage or control or improve you, but to understand and encourage and stand beside you. I spent 15 years trying to earn David's approval by changing myself to fit his expectations. It took me another 5 years to learn that his approval was never actually available. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because the game itself was rigged. The plot twist in my story isn't dramatic or cinematic. There was no moment of revelation where I discovered David was cheating, no explosive confrontation that changed everything overnight. The twist was quieter, more profound, realizing that the person I'd been trying so hard to please was never going to be pleased, and that this wasn't a failure on my part, but a fundamental incompatibility between what he wanted from a wife and what I needed from a partner. He wanted someone who would orbit around his life like a satellite, reflecting his success and supporting his ambitions without casting a shadow of her own. I needed someone who would orbit with me, 2 planets in the same solar system, each maintaining our own gravity while being drawn together by mutual attraction. The real twist was understanding that leaving wasn't giving up on love. It was finally making space for the right kind of love to find me. Looking back now, I can see that my mother's advice about marriage being work that leaves bruises on your heart was both right and wrong. Marriage is work, absolutely. But the work should be about growing together, compromising together, building something together. It shouldn't be about one person constantly working to become acceptable to the other. The bruises shouldn't be on your heart. They should be on your hands, evidence of the labor you've both put into creating something beautiful and sustainable. Last week, Emma asked me if I was happy I got divorced. We were driving home from her soccer practice, and the "pa kwai" question came out of nowhere the way teenage questions often do. That's complicated, I told her, because honesty seemed more valuable than a simple yes or no. I'm sad that your dad and I couldn't figure out how to be happy together. I'm sad that our family had to be divided. But I'm grateful that we all ended up in a healthier situation. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. I think I understand, she said finally. Like, Sometimes you have to break something to fix it properly. Something like that, I agreed. As we pulled into our driveway, I caught sight of Michael through the kitchen window, helping Jake with homework, while Sophie video called from college. The scene was so ordinary, so beautifully mundane, that it made my chest tight with gratitude. The therapist I started seeing helped me understand that my guilt was normal, but misplaced. Children, she explained, are incredibly resilient, but they're also sensitive to emotional atmospheres. Emma and Jake had been living in a house where tension was constant, where they'd learned to gauge Daddy's mood before speaking, where they'd absorbed lessons about relationships that would shape their expectations for years to come. You're not disrupting their stability, she told me. You're giving them a chance to see what stability actually looks like. After 2 weeks at Rebecca's, I found a small apartment across town from our family home. It had 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that got beautiful afternoon light. The kids would have to share a room, and there wasn't space for all their toys, but it felt like possibility in a way our big house never had. Moving day was bittersweet. David had agreed to let me take the furniture from our guest room and some household items, but he was present for the entire process, watching everything get loaded into the moving truck with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're making a mistake, Sarah," he said as I was boxing up books from our living room. "This isn't what's best for the kids." I looked at Emma and Jake, who were helping by carrying small boxes and seemed excited about the adventure of a new home. They were handling this transition better than I'd expected, adapting to change in the way children do when they feel secure in their parents' love. "You're right," I said. "It's what's best for me. And that's going to be what's best for them in the long run." The first night in our new apartment, Emma climbed into my bed around midnight. "Mommy," she whispered, "it's really quiet here." "Is that okay?" I asked, suddenly worried that the absence of familiar sounds would make it harder for her to sleep. "I like it," she said, snuggling against my side. "It feels peaceful. Out of the mouths of babes." The divorce process was exactly as difficult and expensive as I'd expected. David fought for joint custody, claiming I was unstable and had abandoned our marriage without justification. His lawyer painted a picture of me as selfish and impulsive, someone who'd broken up a happy family because I wasn't satisfied with the comfortable life I'd been provided. My lawyer painted a different picture, one of emotional abuse, financial control, and a woman who'd finally found the courage to leave a harmful situation. We had documentation of David's controlling behavior, testimony from Rebecca and other family members who'd witnessed his treatment of me, and evidence of his threats to take the children if I left. The custody evaluation was the hardest part. A court-appointed psychologist spent hours with each of us, observing how we interacted with Emma and Jake, asking probing questions about our parenting styles and our plans for the future. I was terrified that David's superior financial resources, his stable job and impressive house would outweigh the emotional stability I could offer. But the evaluator was thorough and fair, and she saw what I'd learned to see, that financial security without emotional safety isn't actually security at all. The final custody arrangement gave me primary residential custody, with David having the kids every other weekend and 1 evening per week. It wasn't the 50-50 split he'd demanded, but it was more involvement than I'd feared he'd be awarded given his threats. The financial settlement was less generous than I'd hoped, but more than I'd expected. I wouldn't be wealthy, but I could afford our apartment, childcare, and a return to teaching. David would pay child support, and we'd split major expenses for the kids. Most importantly, I was free. The first year on my own was challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. Going back to teaching after 5 years away required relearning classroom management techniques and catching up on curriculum changes. Emma struggled with the transition between houses, sometimes coming home from David's weekends withdrawn and anxious. Jake, being younger, adapted more easily, but still asked difficult questions about why Mommy and Daddy didn't live together anymore. But there were joys I hadn't expected either. The satisfaction of paying my own bills, making my own decisions, about everything from dinner menus to weekend plans. The pride Emma showed when she brought friends home to our small but cheerful apartment. The way Jake's personality began to shine more brightly when he wasn't constantly worried about being too loud or too messy. I started dating again after about 18 months, tentatively and carefully. The first man I went to dinner with was kind and funny, but I found myself analyzing everything he said for signs of criticism or control. The therapist assured me this hypervigilance was normal, a protective mechanism that would fade as I learned to trust my instincts again. The relationship that surprised me most was the one I rebuilt with myself. Living alone, except for the kids, for the first time in my adult life, I rediscovered interests I'd forgotten I had. I started reading novels again, staying up late with books I chose purely because they sounded interesting. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for during my marriage. I learned to cook foods I actually enjoyed, not just meals that met David's dietary preferences and the kids' pickiness. I decorated our apartment with colors that made me happy, hung artwork that spoke to me rather than matching a predetermined aesthetic. Small acts of self-determination, but they added up to something bigger. The slow, careful reconstruction of an identity that was mine alone. Emma and Jake flourished in ways that surprised me. Without the constant tension that had characterized our household, they became more relaxed, more willing to express their opinions and preferences. Emma's grades improved, and she joined the school's drama club. Jake, who'd been unusually quiet, for a 4-year-old, became more talkative and outgoing. They still had difficult moments, especially around transitions between houses. David remained critical and demanding, though he was more careful about what he said in front of the children now that there were court-ordered guidelines about appropriate communication. But they were learning different lessons now about what relationships could look like. They saw me making decisions confidently, treating myself and others with respect, building a life that reflected my values and priorities. They saw that it was possible to be sad about change while still choosing what was healthier in the long run. 2 years after our divorce was finalized, I ran into David at Emma's school play. He was there with his new girlfriend, a woman 10 years younger than me who worked as a paralegal at his firm. She seemed nice enough, though I noticed the way she deferred to his opinions and laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. Watching them together, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for the marriage we'd never really had. Relief that I was no longer the woman trying so hard to please him. And something that took me a moment to identify. Pity. Not pity for his situation. He seemed happy with his new arrangement, with a partner who hadn't yet learned to question his authority or expect equal treatment. Pity for the narrowness of his emotional world, for his inability to see relationships as anything other than hierarchies where someone had to be in charge. After the play, as we were gathering our things to leave, David approached me. "Sarah," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You look good. Happy." It was the first genuinely kind thing he'd said to me in years, and it caught me off guard. "Thank you," I replied. "I am happy." He seemed to consider this, glancing around at the other families chatting and laughing together in the school auditorium. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we'd tried harder?" he asked. "If we'd gone to counseling or something?" The question hung between us, and I realized he was genuinely curious about my answer. Maybe his new relationship was making him reflect on our old one, or maybe seeing me thriving had shifted his perspective on why our marriage had ended. "I think we tried as hard as we knew how," I said carefully, "but we were trying to make something work that was built on a shaky foundation from the beginning. We wanted different things from a partnership, and we never really figured out how to bridge that gap." He nodded slowly, as if considering this perspective for the first time. "I hope you're happy too, David," I added, and meant it. Whatever our history, he was the father of my children, and their lives were easier when he was content. As I drove home that night, Emma chattering about her performance, and Jake already falling asleep in his car seat. I thought about the question David had asked. What might have happened if we'd tried harder? But I realized I was asking the wrong question. The right question wasn't whether we could have saved our marriage with more effort. The right question was whether the marriage we'd had was worth saving. Whether the version of myself I'd become in that relationship was someone I wanted to remain, and the answer to that was clear. 3 years after the divorce, I met Michael at a teachers' conference. He was a guidance counselor from a neighboring district, recently divorced himself, with a 13-year-old daughter he adored. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours, covering everything from educational philosophy to favorite books to the challenges of single parenting. I could have lied. I could have made up some story about saving for a surprise, about wanting to contribute more to the household expenses. But looking at him sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of my small rebellion, I felt something shift inside me. A door that had been slowly opening over the past few months suddenly swung wide. "It's my money," I said simply. "Your money?" He stood up, and I took an involuntary step backward. "We're married, Sarah. We don't have separate money. We have our money." "No," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We have your money, and your decisions about how it gets spent, and your opinions about everything. This is mine." What happened next was the worst fight of our marriage. David accused me of being sneaky, dishonest, ungrateful for everything he'd provided. I accused him of treating me like a child, like an employee he could manage and criticize, at will. We said things that couldn't be taken back, revealed resentments that had been festering for years. "You want to leave?" he said finally, his voice cold with contempt. "Go ahead. But you won't get the kids, Sarah. Not when I can prove how unstable you've been. Not when I can show a judge how you've been stealing from our family, planning to abandon your children." The threat hung in the air between us like smoke, acrid and choking. I knew he meant it. David was nothing if not strategic, and he'd already identified the one weapon that would keep me in line. So I stayed. But something fundamental had changed. The mask had slipped, for both of us, and we could no longer pretend that our marriage was anything other than what it had become. A business arrangement where I provided domestic services in exchange for financial security, where my worth was measured by my ability to meet his expectations and requirements. The next few months were a strange kind of hell. We went through the motions of normal family life. Dinners together, weekend activities with the kids, social gatherings where we played the role of the successful couple. But underneath the surface, we were both plotting. David became more controlling, monitoring our accounts more closely, making comments about my fitness as a mother in front of friends and family. He was building his case, establishing a narrative where I was the unstable one, the one who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. I became more careful, more strategic. I documented everything. The comments, the controlling behavior, the way he spoke to me in front of the children. I reconnected with old friends, started taking Emma and Jake to more activities where other parents could see how I interacted with them. I was building my own case, my own narrative. It was exhausting, living like we were adversaries rather than partners. But it was also clarifying. For the first time in years, I could see our relationship for what it really was, without the romantic delusions I'd been clinging to. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. I was making dinner while Emma did homework at the kitchen table, and Jake played with blocks on the floor. It was one of those ordinary moments that make up the bulk of family life. Nothing dramatic, nothing special, just the comfortable chaos of a weeknight routine. David came home from work in a foul mood. Some deal had fallen through, some client had been difficult. I don't remember the details. What I remember is the way he looked around our kitchen, at Emma's school papers scattered across the counter, at Jake's toys on the floor, at me standing at the stove in yoga pants and an old t-shirt, and his expression twisted with disgust. "This place is a disaster," he said. "How is it possible that you had all day to clean up, and this is what I come home to?" Emma looked up from her homework, her 7-year-old face uncertain. Jake continued playing with his blocks, but I could see his little shoulders tense. Children absorb everything, even when we think they're not paying attention. "I've been busy," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Emma had a doctor's appointment this afternoon, and Jake needed—" "I don't want to hear excuses, Sarah. I want to come home to a house that looks like adults live here." Something in his tone, or maybe it was the way Emma's face had fallen, made something snap inside me. I turned off the burner and faced him fully. "You know what, David? You're absolutely right. Adults do live here. 2 adults who should be working together to take care of their family and their home. But we don't have that, do we? We have one adult who comes home and criticizes, and another adult who's supposed to be grateful for the privilege of being criticized." His eyes narrowed. "Don't start with me tonight, Sarah. I'm not in the mood. I'm not starting anything. I'm finishing it." The words came out before I'd fully decided to say them, but once they were in the air, I knew they were true. I was done. Done walking on eggshells, done accepting criticism disguised as concern, done teaching my children that this was what marriage looked like. "Mommy?" Emma's small voice cut through the tension. "Are you and Daddy fighting?" I knelt down next to her chair, taking her hands in mine. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree, sweetheart, but that doesn't change how much we love you and Jake, okay?" Over. The next hour, while David retreated to his home office to make phone calls, I made the most important decision of my adult life. I called my sister Rebecca, who lived 2 hours away in Columbus, and asked if the kids and I could come stay with her for a few days. "Is everything okay?" she asked, and I could hear the worry in her voice. "No," I said simply. "But it's going to be." That night, after David had gone to bed, I packed bags for Emma, Jake, and myself. I moved quietly through the house I'd called home for 8 years, gathering the things we'd need for an extended stay away. Photos, favorite toys, the blanket my grandmother had made for Emma when she was born. I left a note on the kitchen counter, simple and direct. "The kids and I are going to Rebecca's for a few days. We need some space to think about what we want our family to look like going forward. I'll call you tomorrow so we can figure out next steps." As I loaded the car in our driveway at 5:30 in the morning, with my children still sleepy and confused about why we were leaving so early, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. The drive to Rebecca's house was quiet. Emma asked a few questions about how long we'd be staying, whether Daddy would come visit, if she'd have to change schools. I answered as honestly as I could while still being age-appropriate, explaining that Mommy and Daddy needed to figure some things out, but that she and Jake were loved and safe no matter what. Rebecca was waiting for us with coffee and homemade pancakes, her own 2 kids already fed and dressed for school. She hugged me for a long time without asking questions, then set Emma and Jake up in the living room with cartoons while we talked in her kitchen. "How long has it been this bad?" she asked, and I realized I'd been protecting David's reputation even with my own sister. "Years," I admitted. "Maybe from the beginning, but it got worse after the kids were born." She listened while I told her everything: the constant criticism, the financial control, the way he'd threatened to take the children if I left. By the time I finished talking, she was furious on my behalf. "Sarah, honey, this isn't a rough patch. This is abuse. Maybe not physical, but abuse all the same." Hearing her say the word out loud was shocking. I'd never thought of myself as an abused wife. Abuse was dramatic, visible, the kind of thing that left bruises and required police intervention. What David did was subtle, sophisticated, the kind of emotional erosion that happened so gradually you didn't notice until you were drowning. But she was right. I could see it now, from the safety of her kitchen, with the distance that physical space provided. The pattern was clear. The isolation, the criticism, the financial control, the threats. I'd been so deep in it for so long that I'd lost perspective entirely. That afternoon, while the kids played in Rebecca's backyard, I called a lawyer. Then I called a therapist. Then I called the elementary school in Rebecca's district to ask about enrollment procedures. David called 17 times that day. I answered twice, both conversations brief and focused on logistics. He wanted to know when we were coming home, what I thought I was accomplishing with this dramatic gesture, why I was involving Rebecca in our private business. "This isn't dramatic, David," I said during our second conversation. "This is me making decisions about my own life for the first time in 15 years. "You're being ridiculous, Sarah. Running away isn't going to solve anything. Come home and we'll talk about this like adults." But I was done talking like his version of an adult, the kind who listened quietly while he explained all the ways I was falling short of his expectations. The first week at Rebecca's was hard. Emma cried at bedtime, missing her own room and her toys. Jake kept asking when Daddy was coming to get us, confused by the sudden change in routine. I felt guilty for disrupting their lives, for making decisions that affected them without their input. But there were good moments too. Mornings where we ate breakfast without anyone commenting on what I was wearing or how I'd prepared the food. Afternoons where I could read to the kids without worrying about noise levels or mess. Evenings where I could watch whatever I wanted on TV without negotiating or justifying my choices. Small freedoms, but they felt revolutionary. I used to believe that love was supposed to hurt a little. That's what my mother always told me when I was growing up in our small house in Ohio, watching her navigate her own complicated marriage. "Sarah," she'd say, folding laundry with practiced efficiency. "Marriage isn't a fairy tale. It's work, and sometimes that work leaves bruises on your heart." I thought I understood what she meant when I married David 15 years ago. We were both 25, fresh out of college, and I was so desperately in love with his confidence, his ambition, the way he could command a room just by walking into it. He was everything I thought I wanted. Tall, successful, with plans that seemed to stretch endlessly toward a bright future. I was working as a teacher then, proud of my small classroom and my students. But David made it clear that my job was temporary, a stepping stone until we could start our real life together. Our wedding was beautiful. I spent months planning every detail, choosing flowers that would photograph well, tasting cake flavors until my tongue went numb. David showed up on time, looking handsome in his navy suit, and said his vows with the same professional tone he used in business meetings. I should have noticed that then. But I was too caught up in the romance of it all. The way the afternoon light filtered through the church windows, the sound of my grandmother's pearls clicking softly against my collarbones as I walked down the aisle. The first few years weren't terrible. We bought a house in the suburbs, a colonial with a 2-car garage and a kitchen island that I'd dreamed of since I was a teenager, watching home improvement shows. David's career in finance was taking off, and I quit teaching to focus on making our house a home. I threw myself into decorating, into learning how to cook elaborate meals, into being the perfect wife I thought he deserved. But somewhere along the way, perfect became prison. It started with small comments. The way David would glance at me across the dinner table and suggest that maybe I should try a new gym, or that the dress I was wearing made me look older than my age. He never said these things cruelly. That wasn't his style. David was too sophisticated for outright insults. Instead, he delivered his criticisms wrapped in concern, in helpful suggestions, in the kind of constructive feedback he might give a subordinate at work. "I'm just looking out for you, Sarah," he'd say when I'd bristle at his comments. "I want you to be your best self." The problem was that my best self, according to David, was becoming someone I didn't recognize. She was quieter than I naturally was, more agreeable, less likely to challenge his decisions or voice her own opinions. She wore clothes he approved of, kept the house exactly the way he liked it, and learned not to mention the dreams she'd had before marriage. The ones about maybe going back to school, about traveling, about having adventures that didn't revolve around his schedule and his needs. When I got pregnant with Emma, I thought things might change. I thought becoming parents would soften something in David, would remind him of why we'd fallen in love in the first place. And for a brief moment, it did. He was gentle with me during those first few months, protective in a way that felt loving rather than controlling. He'd rest his hand on my growing belly and talk about the future we were creating together. Emma was born on a Tuesday morning in March, after 14 hours of labor that left me exhausted and euphoric. David held her first, and I saw something pass across his face, a vulnerability I hadn't seen since our early dating days. "She's perfect," he whispered. And for a moment, I believed we could be perfect too. But parenthood, as I quickly learned, doesn't fix a broken marriage. If anything, it magnifies every crack that already exists. David threw himself into work with renewed intensity, claiming he needed to provide for his family. I found myself alone with Emma most days, navigating sleepless nights and endless feedings while he attended client dinners and weekend conferences. When he was home, he seemed irritated by the normal chaos of life with a baby, the crying, the mess, the way our carefully ordered existence had been upended by this tiny person who didn't care about his schedule. "Can't you keep her quiet?" he'd ask when Emma would cry during his important phone calls. "Other babies don't scream like this. Maybe you should read some books about sleep training." I did read the books. I read everything I could get my hands on about child development, about sleep schedules, about postpartum depression. That last one hit a little too close to home. I found myself crying at odd moments, feeling overwhelmed by the simplest tasks, wondering if I was failing at the one thing I was supposed to be naturally good at. When I mentioned to David that I might benefit from talking to someone, maybe a therapist, he dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. "You don't need therapy, Sarah. You just need to get organized. Make a schedule. Stick to it." As if depression could be solved with a color-coded planner. 2 years later, I got pregnant with Jake. This time, there was no gentle protectiveness from David, no vulnerable moments of shared anticipation. Instead, there was frustration that I was going to be out of commission again, annoyance that Emma was still not sleeping through the night consistently, and a suggestion that maybe we should hire help. "I don't understand why this is so difficult." "For you," he said one evening, standing in our kitchen while I sat at the table, too tired to even think about starting dinner. Emma was on my lap, refusing to eat the carefully prepared meal I'd made for her, and I was pretty sure I hadn't brushed my hair in 2 days. My mother raised 4 kids and never seemed this overwhelmed. The comparison to his mother stung more than I cared to admit. Margaret was a formidable woman who had indeed raised 4 successful children while maintaining a spotless house and hosting elaborate dinner parties. She was also the kind of woman who believed that a wife's primary job was to make her husband's life easier, no matter the cost to herself. I'd tried to live up to Margaret's example for years, but I was failing spectacularly. Jake's birth was different from Emma's. Maybe it was because I knew what to expect, or maybe it was because I was already emotionally depleted. But the euphoria I'd felt with Emma was replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to seep into every aspect of my life. David barely took time off work, claiming that someone needed to be responsible for our financial security. "I can't afford to be distracted right now," he explained when I asked him to help with the night feedings. "Johnson is considering me for partner. This is our chance to really secure our future. Our future," as if I had any say in what that looked like. The months that followed Jake's birth were some of the darkest of my life. I felt like I was drowning in dirty laundry and sleepless nights, in the constant demands of 2 small children who needed everything from me while their father remained conspicuously absent. David would come home from work, glance around the house with barely concealed disapproval, and ask what I'd done all day. What had I done? I'd kept 2 tiny humans alive, fed, and reasonably clean. I'd read stories and kissed scraped knees and mediated toddler disputes over toys. I'd grocery shopped with a screaming baby and a tantruming 2-year-old. I'd done load after load of laundry. I'd somehow managed to put a meal on the table every night, even though I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten something while it was still hot. But to David, none of that counted as real work. The criticism became more frequent and more pointed. I was too emotional, too disorganized, too focused on the children and not focused enough on him. I let the house get messy. I didn't dress nicely enough when we went out. I'd gained weight that I couldn't seem to lose no matter how hard I tried. "You've let yourself go, Sarah," he said one night as I was getting ready for bed, catching sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. I barely recognized the woman I married. I stared at my reflection. The tired eyes, the body that had grown and fed 2 children, the hair that I kept in a ponytail more often than not because it was practical. And I realized he was right. I didn't recognize her either, but not for the reasons he thought. The woman in the mirror looked defeated. She looked like someone who had spent so many years trying to be what everyone else needed, that she'd forgotten who she actually was. That was the night I started planning my escape. It wasn't a dramatic decision, made in the heat of anger or hurt. It was quiet and methodical, the same way I'd learned to do everything else in my marriage. I started by opening my own bank account, transferring small amounts from our joint account each week. Money from grocery trips, household expenses, anything I could manage without raising suspicion. I researched divorce lawyers online while the kids napped, clearing my browser history afterward like a teenager hiding secrets from parents. I looked into apartments I could afford on my own, calculated childcare costs, figured out how I could go back to teaching after 5 years away from the classroom. The planning took months, and during that time, I felt more like myself than I had in years. Having a secret, having a goal that was mine alone, gave me a sense of purpose that I'd forgotten was possible. But then David found out about the bank account. I came home from grocery shopping one afternoon to find him sitting at our kitchen table with bank statements spread out in front of him, his face dark with anger. "What is this, Sarah?" His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous in it that made my stomach clench.